for joining us to this session, the second session of the Spring School International Politics and Security. Welcome also to the panelists. We have here Professor Varsori and Professor Westad, Nuti, and Zubok will join us soon. Unfortunately, Professor Elena Calandri could not join us because she has a last minute commitment, so she was not able to join us today, but I will chair the session on her behalf, and actually we can open the discussion later. Thank you also to Professor Varsori, who is available to open the discussion on behalf of Professor Calandri. So first of all, I will introduce our speakers, we hopefully try to see on the screen as well. I will introduce the first speaker. I'm very pleased that he accepted our invitation. He's Professor Arne from he's professor at the Yale University. Arne is a scholar of modern international and global history with a specialization in the history of Eastern Asia since the 18th century. Professor Westad has published 16 books, most of which deal with 20th century Asian and global history topics, for which he is definitely a leading scholar. Today, Westad is mainly interested in researching histories of imperialism, first and foremost in Asia, but also worldwide. He is also trying to figure out how China's late 20th century economic reforms came into being and how their results changed the global economy. Professor Westad will give a paper dealing with the Cold War and China in the wider framework of the long transition from bipolarism to the new international order, the scientific debate, which is obviously the title of this session of the Spring School. I hope that Professor Westad is with us.
I am indeed. Thank you, Valentina. I think someone has to turn on the video at your end because I can't do it from here.
Yeah, actually, the IT service will help us. Just let us see Professor Westad. Professor Westad, you must know that this is the first hybrid event that we are organizing at the department. So hopefully we will have, some, they needed to solve some technical problems.
I think you are doing ever so well with regard to this. And here we go, I think, with the video. Hello, good afternoon in Italy, in Padua. I wish I could be there with you in person.
Hi, Arne.
Okay, great. Welcome, Professor Westad. So I leave immediately you the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, Valentina. It is really wonderful to be able to participate in this summer school. I wasn't joking when I said that I would much rather have been there in person. Padua is one of my favorite cities in Italy, and it would have been wonderful to be there and discuss these things with all of you. But things being as they are, we may have to postpone that a little bit and then hopefully come back to that in the fall or in the winter. And I'm looking forward then to seeing many of my friends in Italy and in other parts of Europe. So what we're going to talk about this afternoon, from my perspective, is the development of China from the late Cold War era and up to today. And then try to contrast this, if I understand correctly, with other countries, other major powers, major centers of power in the case of the EU, with Professor Varsori's presentation, to understand the current situation better. And this fits in really well because these are the kinds of things that I'm interested in at the moment, as Valentina said when she introduced me. So I'm very eager to try to find out more about the transformation, maybe perhaps especially the transformation of the global economy that China has been such a significant part of since the late 1970s and early 1980s. I have a new book that's co-written with my dear friend and colleague, Professor Chen Jian, which we are just delivering the manuscript for it now. And that is a book that looks at the history of China from the end of the Cultural Revolution to the establishment of what the Chinese call reform and opening. So from the late 1960s up to the mid 1980s. That should be out next spring, so about a year from now. Okay, so my remarks for the next 15 minutes or so will be in three parts. So the first one is on the Cold War and the rise of China. The second one is on China and what you could call the unipolar moment after the Cold War ended, the relatively short period of American global predominance, United States as a hyperpuissance, as the French would say, a hyperpower. And then finally about China finding its way in what I believe already today is a multipolar world. So on the first point, I think there are very few countries that benefited more from the way the Cold War ended than China. This is obviously true in economic terms, because it was the turn to work with the United States against the Soviet Union, very close relationship from the early 1970s on, that facilitated China's tremendous economic rise. It was not the intention from the beginning, as a number of us, including Vlad Zubok, have pointed out. This was not the intention from the beginning. It was a security alliance between the United States and China, much more than an alliance that in the eyes of the Chinese then leadership, Mao Zedong and his leadership group, intended to revolutionize the Chinese economy. But from the late 1970s on, with Deng Xiaoping's new leadership in place, this is what that leadership group of the Chinese Communist Party proceeded to do. They made use of the political and strategic alliance between the United States and China to hypercharge a market-oriented, an export-oriented Chinese economy, where the Americans were the #1 promoters of China's participation in global capitalist exchanges. So this offered unique opportunities for China to rise economically, opportunities that China then made use of to become a hypercharged global export-oriented economy with, as everyone knows, phenomenal rates of growth from the 1980s up to the early 2000s. So China was a net beneficiary of the Cold War and the way it ended. It also believed, leadership believed, that they would be a beneficiary in terms of their international and strategic position, because they regarded the Soviet Union as their #1 enemy, to the point that they believed that China would be safer with the Soviet Union, if not absolutely defeated, then much diminished. In other words, they were willing to live with a US-led world as long as they would feel reasonably safe within it. It could even be argued, and that's an interesting discussion, I think, for this panel, that China contributed very significantly in its own way to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I tend to think there is something to that. The Soviet Union would not have collapsed at the moment when it did, I think, without the extra pressure that was put on it by the Chinese. But we can discuss that later. So then we end up, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, with a world that has left the bipolar system of Cold War competition behind. And we move on to this brief, maybe 2 decades long, maybe a little bit less than that, unipolar moment with the United States overall as the most powerful pole. And I think there are 2 explanations. I think most of the people who are here will know that, for China's reorientation during that moment, during those 2, sort of less than 2 decades. One is this generally the realist interpretation. So what happened is that the Soviet Union collapsed, the United States and China started to rival each other, simply because that's what great powers do. When they were the only ones left at the great power table, they would necessarily, because of their inherent interests, start to rival each other. No further explanation is necessary. A number of my international relations colleagues would argue, because this is how great powers behave. Now, I'm skeptical of that explanation. Skeptical in the sense that I believe that there is probably a bit more to it than that. I'm not denying that over, in the course of the last 2,000 years of history, great powers have generally rivaled each other. But there have to be more of an understanding put into this, I think, both about the hows and the whys in terms of how these matters developed. It was not just a given that this would be the way that it developed. And I think there are two main reasons why China and the United States in this period cooperated to quite some extent, but also started to rival each other. I think one is the interest that both of them have in the expansion of the global capitalist marketplace, what we generally refer to, maybe not so much today, but used to refer to as globalization, which of course really isn't globalization as such. It's a globalization of a particular form of economic exchange. So both of them had an interest in this, but from two very different starting points. So the United States wanted to preserve the position that it had within this system, and wanted to avoid taking the consequences of other countries being able to produce better and cheaper and in the end more efficiently than what the United States was able to do. And China was that challenger in economic terms. You see already from the very beginning of the post-war moment, in spite of American support, for instance, for China joining the World Trade Organization, etc., you see those tensions starting to rise. And you also see within the United States an increasing preoccupation, particularly around 2000, with loss of jobs, loss of economic position for ordinary Americans, and the belief, misplaced in my view, but still strongly held, that China was stealing American jobs, that economic development of this kind benefited China, not necessarily the United States. So that's one issue. Why, in a period in which the United States had remarkable international predominance, you still saw the development of these kinds of issues and tensions. And the second one is probably even more interesting for the lead up to our own times. And that had to do with domestic developments within China itself. So China went through, from the early 1980s and up to the mid 2000s, a period of remarkable growth, of an intensity that you rarely see in human history. It was a freewheeling, very open-ended kind of growth, with a lot of people becoming quite rich, but also even more people not feeling that the economy worked quite for them, or not quite yet. So I think for a long time, the miracles of that economic development in China were so strong that even for those who didn't immediately benefit from it, there was this sense that the rising tide lifts all boats, and in the future, they would be wealthier and richer. They could look at the development of a Chinese middle class, which is remarkable. I mean, when I first came to China in the late 1970s, what bound Chinese together was that the vast majority were equally poor. By 2010, you had got a middle class with a European, a EU average buying power of somewhere between 400 and 500 million people. That's a remarkable development, but it still meant that 700, close to 800 million Chinese did not have those kinds of opportunities. And the tensions created by that, I think, led in the direction gradually of a stronger emphasis on state coordination, on dealing with inequality, not perhaps in a personal sense, but inequality in a broader geographic sense, to try to do more for those regions that have been left behind. And I think that it was very much those agendas that both propelled Xi Jinping with his very statist orientation to the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, but also then, when we get closer to our own time, sustained a number of measures that in name were intended to deal with these growth problems, social growth problems in China, but in reality was made use of by the CCP leadership to move in a much more authoritarian direction overall. So that brings us then finally to China's position now. That it's not just the Chinese economy, of course, that has grown enormously. China's government capabilities in all ways has also grown, particularly over the past decade, including its military and strategic potential. So I think there was a sense among many people, including people who do not necessarily support the current Chinese leadership in all matters in China, that after the global financial crisis, the capitalist crisis, mainly in finance, in the late 2000s, 2008, 2009, that this was in a way China's moment, that in spite of the domestic tensions that existed in China, China would come out of this much better than what the United States had. There was a kind of fast forwarding of history among many Chinese intellectuals and some Chinese policymakers that were saying that it wasn't just the tremendous growth of China at that point over a generation that had transformed the world. It was the projection of China really becoming number one in terms of the international order. And I think that's what signifies, from a Chinese perspective, the multipolar world that we were moving towards, that China really believed that the unipolar moment was over, that China had taken its place, if not immediately as number one, but as an equal to the United States, and that there was this strong feeling, of course, then magnified many times over by President Trump when he was elected, that the United States was not willing to accept an equal position for China, or in the future that China would surpass the United States. So there is that sense as well that within a multipolar world, the United States is singularly after keeping China, if not contained, at least keeping China in a controlled position, which the current Chinese leadership is not willing to accept. It is remarkable now to see how the language on the Chinese side has changed. During the Ukrainian crisis, which we may want to discuss in further detail later on, I've been making a habit of reading Renmingerbao, the People's Daily, the official newspaper of the Chinese Communist Party, every morning. And it's remarkable to see that every day, as a matter of course, there has to be one anti-American headline. They usually alternate these days between saying that the United States is responsible for the war in Ukraine, never, of course, mentioning in any way that Russia invaded Ukraine. And then the next day, it would be something about the unavoidable decline of the American economy, that the United States is irreversibly in decline and China is rising. So, and I'll end on this, Valentina. This makes me believe that what we are seeing now is not so much, in any meaningful sense, a return to a kind of Cold War scenario. In fact, as I've argued elsewhere, I see relatively few parallels in sort of international systemic terms between the Cold War bipolarity and what we are seeing today. The world is not becoming more bipolar, it's becoming more multipolar, even though the United States for a long time is going to be the most powerful country within that multipolar world. It reminds me, so the global situation actually reminds me more, and this is somewhat problematic for those of you who know your history, which I guess is most people on this call. It reminds me more of the late 19th century world or very early 20th century world, where there are not cold wars, but a set of hot wars, like the one we are now seeing in Ukraine, that increasingly bring great powers into conflict with each other. It also reminds me, with regard to the current situation, a little bit of the situation in Europe at that particular point. So where you had the late 19th century's hypercharged rising power, Germany, allied with a declining multinational empire right next to it, Austria-Hungary, an empire that had quarrels with almost all of its neighbors, and in spite of its decline, was still capable of carrying out various kinds of military confrontations, which eventually, of course, pushed towards the outbreak of World War I. That's the kind of scenario in the China-Russia relationship that I see at the moment. And I think it's essential for all of us that China is able to pull back from that situation, because as we see in that earlier example, things could end up very badly. So Chinese leadership now in many ways has a set of very hard choices to make with regard to where it wants to go in the future. The first issue here is realizing that with great power comes great responsibility. So the idea of sitting back and doing very little, except rhetorically, as China has done so far with the Ukraine crisis, probably is not a very good idea. What the answer of the Chinese leadership to those challenges will be, we don't know. I think that's the key issue to look at in terms of China's international relations over the next, certainly the next months, but probably also over the next couple of years. So that's all I had to say, Valentin, just in terms of introduction on this issue.
Thank you so much, Professor Westad. I think that we can also I hope that you heard the clapping. So
I did. Thank you.
Great. Actually, we have about 70 students here, so unfortunately you are not able to see them, but hopefully maybe the IT service will allow you to do so. Thank you so much for your contribution, which was very interesting indeed. I'm leaving the floor to the second speaker then, and then maybe we can have a discussion at the end. Is it that fine, Professor Westad, to you? Okay, great.
That's fine with me. I have, so I can stay on for a little bit less than an hour from now. So we should be able to have discussions afterwards.
Okay. So maybe given this fact, I think that maybe the best choice is try to do a discussion one by one. So maybe we can leave you earlier and do not, overlap with your own commitments. So
I have a suggestion, Valentina. Why don't we hear from Professor Zubok first?
Yeah.
And then we could do a joint discussion after that, and then I'll stay on for as long as I can. Is that okay?
That's fine, definitely. Did Professor Zubok join us?
Yes, I did. Yes.
Okay, great.
Well, I have the same issue as Professor Westad. I cannot turn the video on. So, you're in full control. The West is in full control.
No, the IT service is in full control.
Yes,
I kindly ask to them to change the. Are you able to do so? Okay. So I'm going to introduce Professor Zubok while the IT service is solving the problem. Professor Zubok is Professor of International History at the London School of Economics. He is an expert on the Cold War, the Soviet Union, Stalinism, and Russian intellectual history in the 20th century. His most recent books are The Idea of Russia, The Life and Work of Dmitry Likhachev, if I'm right in saying that. And a very well-known book, A Failed Empire, the Soviet Union in the Cold War from Stalin to Gorbachev, and obviously Zhivago's Children, the Last Russian Intelligentsia. I'm very happy to have you here, even if virtually, Professor Zubok, and I'm leaving you the floor with the paper, Russia as a Successor of the Soviet Union, the Saga of Not Fitting a Unipolar World.
Okay, I still believe that my video cannot appear, which is fine. Okay, choose visual.
It will appear, I guess, in a few seconds.
Okay, no problem. Yeah, great to see you, Valentina and Antonio and Arne. You know, I can only join Arne in saying I wanted to come to Padova. It is also one of my favorite cities in Italy, but you know, circumstances intervene, just as they do time and again with Russia and the Soviet Union. They intervene in all kinds of manner and create surprises. When you, Valentina, mentioned my books, you know, news travels slowly. I would add the last one, which was published by Yale in October, November 2021. It's called Collapse, the Fall of the Soviet Union. So much of my talk will relate to this collapse. And of course, in the current situation, I've been asked by a number of my colleagues, Professor Zubok, are you going to write a sequel to your book, Collapse? Maybe it will be Collapse of Russia. I preferred a much more neutral and evolutionary title, you know, not fitting into the unipolar world, because I do believe that striving for a multipolarity was something that united the late Soviet Union and late Soviet foreign policy, particularly Gorbachev and Shevardnadze foreign policy, with what happened under Yeltsin and even under Putin, at least until recently. Can you hear me now, by the way?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was just trying to understand what was happening. And probably you have your webcam off. That's what they told me.
Whatever I can do to join.
Because we see your picture.
Yes.
We don't see you live.
Yes. Well, I don't have, unfortunately, the function for so view, edit, profile, rename. I don't have a function of turning on my video for some strange reason. So, you know, I would prefer just to go on. Time is precious.
Sure,
At least you can hear me.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
So let me start with the moment when the Soviet Union was collapsing. And the discussion at the time in Moscow can be boiled down to two lines. One line I would call the Gorbachev-Shakhnazarov line, Shakhnazarov being the closest aide to Mikhail Gorbachev. And that was the line how the Soviet Union should proceed in this turbulent times, particularly after the collapse of the Soviet bloc in 1989-90. It was the vision of a common European home, of course, but with some realist touch. This project was to have the Soviet Union reformed as some kind of larger Russia allied with other republics such as Ukraine, the Central Asia, of course, and playing a role in Europe similar to what Russia had done during the time that we call the European concert of powers. In retrospect, many people dismissed the Gorbachevian project, but it indeed required imagination on both sides. I would say it was not entirely hopeless, just as the idea of refashioning the Soviet Union, as I discovered when writing my book, was not entirely hopeless. The greatest, I should say, challenge to this line was from inside the Soviet Union, namely from the leadership of the largest republic, the Russian Federation. And this line I would call the Yeltsin-Boris line, Boris being the strategist of Boris Yeltsin at the time. Their line can be boiled down to the following. The Soviet Union had been a product of the imperial and totalitarian past. This entity is doomed anyway. So the Russian Democrats, and Yeltsin in particular, should take credit for destroying it, for dismantling the USSR, recognizing independence of all the republics that made part of the USSR. And then on this condition, Russia, acting sort of on a a clean slate principle, would return to Europe and join the West as an equal and respected great power. In October 1991, a telling discussion took place between Shahnazarov and Bourbolis in the absence of the principles, but still, I think it is important. When Bourbolis essentially described this line, what I've just described, Shahnazarov responded to them that yes, but Russia's national interests might be better met and expressed if some kind of a reformed union, let's drop the word Soviet, some kind of reformed union would remain in Eurasia. In this way, Russia would be more respected by the West, in fact, not less. If, however, the Union get dismantled, other republics of the Soviet Union, and I'm almost quote verbatim what Shahnazarov said, would quickly join other blocs, and NATO would quickly be on the borders of Russia. And what would Russia then do? Shahnazarov asked Bourbolis. Would Russia use force to reclaim the post-Soviet space? It's clearly unthinkable. Well, we now know 30 years later that it is quite thinkable. When Yeltsin implemented his vision and did dismantle the Soviet Union, it's hard to exaggerate the scope of his gamble. I should remind the young people in the audience that in the old book with Pleshakov, I wrote about the revolutionary imperial paradigm that guided the Soviet, the Kremlin rulers. And in a sense, it was a burden, but it was also immense prestige and immense place in international system. So many countries around the world looked towards the Soviet Union as not a typical militarized autocracy with authoritarian system, but some kind of a second pole that opposed the West, that all post-colonial countries didn't quite like and wanted to find a room for maneuvering between at least two poles, if not more. By destroying the Soviet Union, Yeltsin, counted on Russia staying as a great power, but he, in a sense, rejected all other things that the Soviet Union had, in addition to ideology. The Soviet Union still had an aura of the Potsdam-Yalta system that had been recognized by Roosevelt and Churchill long ago, yes, but it was a historical record. Yeltsin recognized the Soviet role in decolonization process when, of course, briefly, the Soviet industrialization model looked very attractive. It stopped, but still, the Soviet Union held a respectable role as a promoter of decolonization. In a sense, by joining the West in the way he did, Yeltsin squandered many opportunities and an expectation to get the new ones. And he wanted that Russia to stay a great power, not inferior to the United States. So we can say in retrospect that the death of the Soviet Union gave birth to Russian imperialism. The choice was only between a more conservative, more Soviet-like imperialism and a new liberal one, which, of course, Yeltsin preferred. During his time and power, however, Yeltsin and the Russian elites around him confronted a big disappointment. And hence the main title of my paper. They discovered that Russia simply could not fit into the international order on the terms Russia expected. Three things I would like to mention. What Yeltsin and the Russian elites gradually discovered was that the United States exercised an unrivaled hegemony in Europe and in the West in general. There was simply no alternative to it. Yes, American hegemony was benign. It was an empire by invitation, quoting memorable words by Lundestad, but any attempts by France or anyone to challenge this hegemony inexorably failed. Secondly, Yeltsin and the Russian elites also found that, contrary to what they expected, Russia ended up at the end of the line of joining the West. Mary Sorotti, in his excellent book, Not One Inch, gives a lot of interesting new documents supporting this thesis. Washington felt that it was a winner. NATO had to be expanded. And first priority should go to former Soviet satellites from Eastern Europe, and maybe the Baltic states, who really urged Washington to join the West. Yeltsin's Russia wanted to be the first one to join, but this wish simply could not be granted for too many reasons, one of which was Russia's size, another was Russia's border with China. In any way, no discussion exists, no serious discussion exists within NATO or European Union. I would be grateful to be contradicted on this, that even looked at realistic possibilities of Yeltsin's Russia, the Russian Federation, of becoming a member of the existing Western institutions. And thirdly, while Russia was in this limbo, particularly since Clinton announced the new course of expansion of NATO to the east, realities on the ground around Russia and inside Russia, from the Caucasus to Transnistria in Moldova and to Central Asia, remained highly, highly complicated. It's, we get this discourse from the sides, from the Balts, from Georgians and others who are Russia's neighbors, that Russia's interest remained imperial, both in terms of imposition of Russia's will and, other crude moves that Russia did. But this is only a part of the story. There's a Russian story that is more Swiftian in a sense, using, of course, the Gulliver analogy. Yeltsin and his diplomats, and I, basically read quite a few diaries and memoirs of those guys, found themselves during the 90s in a position of a new Gulliver, picked by Lilliputians, provoked, teased by Lilliputians. Every time a Gulliver attempted to make a move, the Lilliputians would run to the master of a distant, huge island, the United States, with cries, "The ogre is awake, the ogre is attacking us." So, of course, the Swiftian dilemma required a lot of tact, diplomacy, and soft power that Russians in the 90s lacked. Instead, Yeltsin attacked Chechnya and got bloodied Russia in the war in Chechnya that he could not win, and which tarnished badly Russia's reputation with regard to Eastern Europeans, yes, Georgians, yes, many Ukrainians, and the Balts, who again ran to a distant, huge island with the cries, "We always told you so," that Russia remains a bad bear that, is about to attack. One finds the last gasp of a liberal empire expectation around 2005, 2006, when Anatoly Chubais, one of the makers of Russian liberal reforms, came up with this slogan of a liberal empire. It was the last attempt by Russian liberals, who were progressively losing authority at the top of the pyramid, to Russian conservatives, to play with the theme of Russian influence in the near abroad, but they were quickly pushed aside. So increasingly, another type of view gained currency, according to which the United States and the West did not respect Russia, treated Russia like a Sierra Leone with missiles. And of course, conveniently, Western media played up to this image, indeed writing about Russian weakness, Russian kleptocracy, and indeed comparing Russia to a small African country with missiles. We know that in 1999, Yeltsin resigned in frustration, both on domestic and international grounds. On domestic grounds, his reforms led to a Russian default in 1998. But in terms of foreign policy, he sort of admitted that the early Russian liberal imperial mythology, a myth, that somehow Russia would shed the Soviet a totalitarian imperial past, and that would guarantee her a high status in the West, that this mythology was wrong, it failed. As I said, the vacuum was immediately filled by other kinds of ideas depicting Russia as an island surrounded by hostile West, deceived by, that Russia was deceived by the West, that the only way to survive in this world, there are two ways actually to survive to this world: a complete submission to the hegemon, the United States, and or an alternative of cultivating a multipolarity by all means possible, primarily diplomatic, hence Primakov's diplomacy, but also using Russia's oil and gas power. And that originally was what Vladimir Putin inherited, and this is what he implemented. I don't have time to talk about Putin's growing two obsessions with NATO enlargement to the east and Ukraine, in the context of what he believed was a wave of colored revolutions and the Western plan to encircle Russia. So let me just say that it definitely should be treated seriously because, as we can see, it was the road to a war. It was the road to a catastrophic war. Although it remains regional, nobody for now, the European Union, Biden, or, I think Russian leadership itself knows how to find an exit from. The only thing that I would like to say in conclusion is that people often compare American failure to guide Russia towards democracy to, successes of the United States during the early Cold War in Japan, in Western Europe. When you look back to this, one thing springs in mind. Well, for many things, of course, comes up. Difficulties of dealing with Russia that was not having experience of democracy, even in comparison with Japan. But what I wanted to conclude with today is that, as we know, in Japan and in Western Europeans, Americans, because they were in the Cold War with the Soviet Union, had a much lighter touch, I would say, with regard to the defeated powers, that is, Germany and Japan. In fact, a person like Kennan advised to drop all the bromides about democratization and just focus on building up those countries and as allies of the West. And that was remarkably successful. Plus, those countries chose the path of democracy. With Russia, during the 90s, those bromides were very much upfront. Democratization and liberalization, according to the blueprints of IMF, were proposed to the Russian liberals and sold to the Russian public as a sine qua non for Russia becoming an ally of the West. And I think at some point they backfired. Of course, much of the blame lies on Russia and Russian domestic politics. But even today, when this discussion in the West is squashed after Putin attacked Ukraine, this discussion must continue and is necessary for a balanced, sophisticated understanding of Russia's future and Russian current challenge to the international order. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Zubok. Very interesting paper indeed. So I'm leaving the floor for some comments to Professor Varsori, and maybe I will add some questions to later.
Well, thank you very much. And obviously, I would like to thank the organizer of this spring school, and in particular, Valentine, for inviting me. And well, speaking about Russia, I told Valentine that I am going to become a sort of Stakhanov, you know, because I am involved today, tomorrow, and also on Friday, you know, in 3 different roles. So something which reminds me of the old Soviet Union, you know. But anyway, well, and it's also a pleasure to be here and to meet him. Luckily, only through a monitor, through a video, with some colleagues, and especially Arne and Vlad, because with Leopoldo, I hope I am going to meet him in a few days in Rome. So, well, it's not easy, you know, to develop some comments about these 2 interesting papers, also because it was not my role to be the discussant, you know, and I discovered to be a discussant just, I think, 2 hours ago. Sorry about that. But, you know, I was very much interested in what was said by both Professor Arne Westad and Professor Vlad Zubok, you know, and I would prefer more than trying to do some comments, well, to pose some questions, you know, which came out, you know, of what you said of your papers, also because I think it may be of more interest to our audience, which is largely composed by our university students. So I will start with Arne, and well, you spoke about China, and I have two questions. The first is, I said, well, China was the power which got more benefits, you know, from globalization and so on, and I wonder whether, to a certain extent, Tiananmen was something which was positive for China, you know, because I got the impression that it gave China the possibility to pursue a low-profile attitude for at least 10 years, you know, and to focus on the economic development. And from the economic viewpoint, as you pointed out, of course, there was a common belief that you know, China involvement in globalization was something positive for everybody. No, not only for the Chinese, but also for the Western Europeans, for the Americans, and so on. And this sort of low-profile attitude, in my opinion, probably, you know, led to a misperception about China. The idea, well, the Chinese are just interested in developing their economy, in transforming their society. They will be involved in the globalization. They have no real ambitious goal, and so on and so on. While on the contrary, perhaps my question is, what about a sort of long-term strategy? You know, I think the Chinese are convinced time is on our side and we can wait. So we can be cautious at the beginning, and then to grow from the economic viewpoint, and then to play a leading political role, and then why not also a military role, you know. So that's one of my first question about your interpretation, about your view of Chinese role in the international system. You can go slowly, you know, but as I think it was Winston Churchill, slowly but surely. And so in the long run, this is the best choice and the best view for our intention, and also to our international role. Also, this question is related to the fact that in my opinion, there is another problem which must be raised. I think that till a few years ago, the general interpretation about China's international role, well, China always is a great economic power, you know, and it can be also an important political actor in international affairs. But, you know, China is focusing more on, you know, what happened in Asia, you know, so a sort of regional power and you know, the interest, the Chinese interest, it might be reconciled with the interest of other great powers, such as the United States. Is it still true? Because, you know, there is an increase in military expenditure, you know, during the last few years. And what about the future of Taiwan? You know, I think we accepted what happened in Hong Kong just, you know, 1 year ago. Without saying almost nothing, you know. We focus on the pandemic disease and so on, so why care about Hong Kong, you know? And perhaps in the future, why care about Taiwan, you know? But, you know, just a question, you know. And the second question came to my mind on the basis of some reading, you know, and some time ago I read some books by Julia Lovell, you know, who is a specialist in of Chinese history, and I was really impressed more by the book about Maoism as a global phenomenon. You know, I don't know whether it's the right title, but something like that. You know, but you know, by the book on the war with the British Empire in the 19th century, you know, the Opium War, you know, and especially by the final chapters, in which this author try to explain the Chinese leadership view of the Western world on the basis of Chinese history, especially of Chinese history of the 19th century and the early 20th century. So the idea, we cannot have confidence in the West, you know, and of course there is this sort of lack of confidence at the basis of our foreign policy, and the importance of history, of past history, especially 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, in shaping today's Chinese foreign policy. Of course, I don't know that I agree, you know, with this interpretation, but I think it's an interesting interpretation. So that's the second question. And I come very quickly with Vlad Zubok, and of course I read your book, you know, which is very interesting, and I like it very much. I have two questions. The first is on the period before the collapse, you know, of the Soviet Union. I mean, just the period before, you know, the coup d'etat. And I am convinced, because I studied a bit, you know, this aspect of this period, that there were some Western European politicians who were convinced that a possible collapse of the Soviet Union was something negative, you know, and that the Soviet Union had to play a role in a future, you know, European and international balance. If I think about the attitude by François Mitterrand, or the attitude by, well, also by Margaret Thatcher, or also by Giulio Andreotti, they thought, well, it's important to have the Soviet Union, of course, no longer an enemy, of course, a partner, you know, an actor, which is important to stay there, because the collapse of the Soviet Union will lead to a period of uncertainty, of tensions, and we don't know what is going to happen, you know. It's the collapse of an international system, and we don't know which may happen, you know, in the future. So I think they really believe, you know, in the possibility to transform, you know, the Soviet Union into a sort of another pillar of a new international system. Think about the idea of the reform of the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, you know, to touch on the Paris Declaration and the idea, okay, a new European system, you know, which is a bit bizarre because it's something which Putin was just reminding just a few days ago, you know, the idea of a new European system, you know, as a part of a wider international system. And the question is why this project, which was shared by some important Western European leaders, was doomed to fail. We know the question of the London J7 meeting in July 1991, you know, and you know, the pressure by Gorbachev, I need your help, I need your economic help, you know, and we know that the French, the Italian, the Germans, they were in favor, you know, of doing something. And of course, you know, the ones who opposed were, you know, the Americans, you know, the British, and also it seems also the Canadians, you know, and the Japanese, you know. So why, you know, was it just because, well, we don't want to waste our money, you know, because we have no longer confidence in the economic reform by Gorbachev, or because they already thought we have to bet on Yeltsin, you know. You know, I just published this volume of Italian foreign policy, and for example, in January 1991, you know, for example, Andreotti was much in favor, you know, of supporting Gorbachev, but there was, you know, for somebody else, for example, the former ambassador in Moscow, Sergio Romano, who already said in January 1991, we have to drop Gorbachev and we have to support Yeltsin because this is in our interest. You know, Gorbachev is dead, you know, it's over, it's experience, and we have to find out somebody else. I think without thinking about what can happen, you know, with Yeltsin. And the second question is, so sorry, it's obvious, you know, to a certain extent that I'm going to deal with what is happening, today. You know, the question is, obviously, yeah, Putin and Russia, they are the aggressor. You know, there is no question about that. You know, but I always wonder whether the enlargement on NATO was really a positive choice. You know, or at least perhaps it may be limited to some, you know, to some nations. But we know that there were two different enlargements. You know, the first was the Baltic states and Hungary and Poland, but then it's okay, we can admit to NATO also other nations. You know, I wonder whether in the 1990s, the idea of NATO's enlargement was just a sort of response to the tension and difficulties of Yeltsin in Russia, or was it, you know, something different? Because if we, as historian, we remember, because things are always different, you know, in history. But, you know, sometimes I think about the 1920s, you know, and the idea to set up the cordon sanitaire. You know, it's, and of course, I don't think that Bolshevik Russia was very happy, you know, about the cordon sanitaire in the 1920s, you know. I think it was better to now, you know, to find out some form of dialogue, you know, and that trying to strengthen too much NATO and to strengthen too much the Western world, but just my personal opinion, you know. So just some question for both of you and to both Arne and Vlad. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Varsori. So first, maybe ask to the panelists to reply to this question. Maybe we can collect some other questions from the audience, if there is any. maybe I can add my own question and then leave the floor to the students who maybe need some more time to, you know, reassess all what has been said during this first hour. So this is, so there is a question and more an impression. So the question is, talking about, I mean, these two countries, Russia and China, I wonder if you consider the contrast between China and the USSR during the Cold War within the framework of the international communist movement, if you think that this contrast played a role in shaping the leadership and the balance of leadership between these two states, or if you think that the ideology did not have anything to do with the development of the Chinese leadership after the end of the bipolar world. And that's the question. And the second one is a comment or maybe an impression that I have. So Professor Westad said that today multipolarism show more similarities with the 19th century, with the history of the Cold War. And Professor Zubok said also that the death of the USSR gave birth to Russian imperialism. So given these two assessments made me think about one of the outcomes of my recent studies on terrorism, thinking about the possibility to consider the history of the 19th century and 21st century as a unitarian process. As you know, we can use this category by Eric Hobsbawm, the short century for this long-term period of history, being the Cold War, rather than a central event as we as Cold War historians consider, as a parenthesis in between this long-term process. I'm not sure that it was clear. There's a kind of suggestion, a thought, maybe more, but I'm still thinking about these issues. So that's the best chance to me to deal with you about that. So there is any other question from the public? Yes, please. Do you mind to come here maybe? So also Professor Westad and Zubok could see you. Thank you.
First of all, okay. First of all, I appreciate all members and people here, especially professors from across, from different universities, and sharing their wisdom with us, you know, to reach our mind. I would ask you about the behavior of the commercial activities of China, and I would ask you all professors to forecast maybe after 50 years whether we are dealing with commercial blood colonialism from China, because it seems to be that we are going to be a slave for China to work and the just utilization of their products, and our economies are going to demise. And I would ask you your forecasting about this. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Any other question? So maybe we have a lot of stuff to discuss, I guess. So maybe we can go ahead with Professor Westad first.
Great, thank you, Valentina. Thanks for the good questions from you, from Professor Varsori. I always enjoy Antonio's questions. I think they always cut to the point of the broader issues we're discussing, and also from the student. And at the end, I have a couple of questions myself for Professor Zubok, because it just so happens that I was teaching his wonderful new book to students last week. In a really, really wonderful conversation. There were some questions that came out of that I think my students would die to hear from the horse's mouth, as it is, in terms of his views. But on the questions on China first, on Tiananmen, so there are two versions now, I think, historiographically as well, in sort of understanding Tiananmen. The first one is as tragedy, the other one is as necessity. My own personal view is that neither of those are correct. I think the tragedy issue is probably closest to my own view. I think because of the way in which the crackdown was carried out, China cut off a few avenues towards a greater extent of pluralism, at least in terms of the freedom of expression, that probably would have served China well, even under Communist Party rule. So I think that's a significant drawback. I mean, I think that could have been done without a loss of stability. But I also think that there is a direct connection, which is the one that hasn't really been explored in much of the historiography so far, Chinese or foreign, about the way in which that crackdown happened and the turn to the very freewheeling, market-oriented form of economic exchange that China saw after that. So my view is, in a way, that opening up for a sort of jubilant approach to embracing the market without many qualifications. And I talked in my presentation about how problematic I see that to be, right? Not just in Eastern Europe, by the way, or in Russia, but also to some extent in China, although the outcome was very different. But I think that from the party's perspective was, in a way of buying loyalty from people who in 1989 had shown that otherwise they would be deeply skeptical of Communist Party rule, communist dictatorship. So there were consequences for China as well, which I think the country now is trying to deal with. On the timing issue, so this is essential. There was a sense, I think, in the first generation of Chinese reform that time was indeed on China's side. And I think quite a few things that have happened since then have proven that that was, broadly speaking, true. But what then often happens, and this goes to Valentina's idea about looking at the 19th and 20th century as a unit, which I very much sympathize with, is what my colleague here at Yale, Paul Kennedy, calls imperial overstretch. I mean, you get to the point where there has been so much waiting and biding your time that you actually end up in a position where a significant group of leaders believe that you have arrived, that you have bided and waited long enough, and now is your moment, right? So I think that's in a way what happened after the global financial crisis in the early 2010s. This is not just about Xi Jinping. I mean, I think that would be a complete misunderstanding. China is not the personalized dictatorship. It is a party dictatorship. And I think there were a number of people at the top of that system who did draw that conclusion, that now it's not just about time being on our side, it is that the moment had actually arrived to deal with a few historical issues, such as Hong Kong, such as getting a more streamlined dictatorship at home, less freedom of opinion, less freedom of thought, in order to deal, is the argument, with many of the social problems that China undoubtedly had. And that leads us then to the issue of what China is going to do with regard to the region. So I believe primarily still, mainly for reasons of capacity, military strategic capacity, that China's orientation will be towards its larger region. Now, of course, because of Putin's action, that region will to a much higher extent also include Russia. Because China now has opportunities with regard to Russia that even the Chinese leadership would not have dreamt of just a few months ago, because of Russia's isolation from the West or from Japan and so on. Will this necessarily lead to conflict? Not necessarily, but it increases the risk of conflict, as Professor Varsori said, especially with regard to Taiwan. I think the current Chinese leadership have drawn some lessons already from what's happening on the ground in Ukraine. I've been amazed at how well informed the Chinese are with regard to the war itself. I strongly suspect that at least in some areas they have people embedded with the Russian forces, so that they can actually understand see up front what is happening now. And I think it's possible that that will lead at least in terms of short-term planning, to a rethink in what was moving quite fast, I think, towards an attempt to subdue Taiwan in one way or another. But we can't tell. And then Professor Varsori's final point on the on the overall Chinese relationship to the West, and the way in which that, if not predetermines, at least predisposes the Chinese understanding of its own position, the century of humiliation, the difficulties that China have had with the outside world. So I'm not a great believer in this. And I don't think in many ways that Julia Lau, who you refer to, is either. I think in sort of ideological terms, this is helpful from a Chinese Communist Party perspective. But I think in the population in general, the understanding of the West, indeed the understanding of the outside world, is not so inherently negative. I mean, if you compare, and it would be hard to get to that, right? Because China has benefited so enormously over the past generation from its interaction with the outside world, very different from Russia, which, as Professor Zubok pointed out, has for good reasons a very different experience, right, with the outside world. That I do not think, I mean, this is useful for ideological purposes, but not so useful for practical purposes. That, in a way, also responds to Valentin's question about the contrast in the practice of communism between China and Russia. So I for a long time believed that Maoism in its mature phase, so going from the late 1950s on, was only tangentially connected to anything that meaningfully could be called Marxism-Leninism. It grew out of it, but it took on a form that was really hard to recognize for anyone who would think of themselves as a Marxist. It was not oriented towards a materialist understanding of forces of growth. It was extremely idealistic, voluntaristic. It dealt with the force of the human will rather than material conditions. There were many moments in which the Chinese under Mao Zedong were claiming that this was the real communism, against the Soviet false communism. That was an issue for a very long time. But if you think about it in real ideological terms, I think, Maoism is very far removed from any real understanding of Marxism. Now, the big question is, did that transformation really create some of the ground, some of the background for the almost sort of orgastic embrace of the market after the late 1970s? I mean, is it possible to argue that the destructive work of Maoism inside China itself, in some strange kind of way, prepared better for the kind of breakthrough of market forces than a much more stable, planning-based, Marxist development pattern that you saw in Russia during that same period? I don't know, but it is a question worth asking. Then on the issue of continuity between 19th and 20th century, I fully agree. I think my last book on the Cold War, my last book ever on the Cold War, I promise, deals with that, at least in part. I mean, how many of the broader trends that we saw in the 20th century grew out of 19th century engagements. So that's also led me to what I'm doing now. I'm trying to write a book which deals with the transformation of empires and imperialisms in the mid-19th century and how that sort of pointed forward to today. On the question of Chinese colonialism, so I don't think China has a colonialism in the form that we normally think of from Western imperialisms. But it does have a pretty clear dedication to control, and control mainly in a financial context. I'm not among those who believe that for most parts of Asia, Middle East, Africa, that it's necessarily a bad thing to have China as a competitor to the West in terms of providing capital, providing technology, providing loans. But it all depends on how one makes use of it. And the problem is that China's predomination with regard to some of these issues, maybe particularly in Africa, has been so strong that the Chinese have been given conditions that they shouldn't have got. But that's mainly an issue of domestic governance, right? In the countries in question. So then briefly, let me turn to the two questions that my students were pressing me on with regard to Professor Zubok's book in the seminar last week. And they thought that I could answer this because Vlad is a close friend and colleague, but I'm not sure I could. The first one is, does Professor Zubok regret the collapse of the Soviet Union? Does he think that that he certainly thinks that it was not preordained? I mean, that's very clear from the book. But was it also something, both for people living in the Soviet Union and for the wider world, that we would have had a better, safer world if the Soviet Union, at least for some time, would have continued to exist? So I know that's a counterfactual, but that's often how students think. And I think it's a valid question. You know, it's a reasonable question. The second one cuts very close to, Vlad, what you said about the Gulliver parallel, which I appreciate, but I'm not sure many of my students did when we got close to it. Not in that form, but in terms of the conclusion in your book. And one of them was saying that, you know, if you lived in the Baltic states, just having regained your independence in the early 1990s, it is not unreasonable to think, given your past history, not just with the Soviet Union, but with Russia, that you needed some kind of alliance with someone more powerful than yourself to hold on to that independence, right? Not just because it had been taken away by Russia and the Soviet Union, but also because of what these occupations, particularly the Soviet occupation, had led to for the peoples of the Baltic states, with large numbers of people deported to Siberia. So their question was, you know, should we regard that wish as unreasonable given the circumstances? Or even if we think it's the wrong choice, you know, was it in many ways, if not predetermined, at least extremely likely when the Baltic states had the choice? So those were two of many questions that came up in my seminar for Professor Zubok. And now, having this wonderful opportunity, I had to pose them back.
Thank you so much, Professor Westad. So I leave the floor to Professor Zubok for Westad's questions, Professor Varsori's questions, and I think that you have a lot of answer to give.
Right. I feel like I'm at the hearings of U.S. commission of some sorts on history, I guess. So it's a rare privilege to be interrogated by both such eminent colleagues as Professor Varsori and Professor Westad, but also Valentina's your interrogation is quite well. You know, I wish we had more time. As always, the beauty of being present at such conference physically is then we can continue the discussion. We go to a nearby trattoria and solve all the world problems. But here we are. You have only, looking at the clock, a few minutes to approach it. And let me start with Professor Varsori's questions, which are very, very interesting. And I tried to answer them myself when I was finishing my book, because what I discovered in the sources, as the Soviet Union was careening towards its demise, at least to its huge economic and political crises, there were two approaches in the West. And one can loosely be associated with the old Europe, Western Europe, where indeed, as Professor Varsori quite eloquently described, that was this preference for the Gorbachevian line of keeping the Union, dropping maybe the word Soviet, and this is actually what they did themselves in 1990-91, dropping the word Soviet, coming up with some kind of Eurasian Union, but keeping much of this space minus probably the Baltics. So, you know, I will try to answer Arne's questions later about the Baltics. But, you know, Gorbachev started negotiating with the Baltic states after the secession of Lithuania in November 1989, at the same time as the Berlin Wall fell down. So it's a separate question, and it could have been resolved in an amicable way. But this question is separate, in my view, from the question whether the Union itself was viable. So on this question, I think Western Europeans took one view, and many influential Americans in the United States took another view. And you can see immediately when Yeltsin challenged the Gorbachevian vision and essentially became the leader of Russian separatism, and not only Russian separatism, he became the leader of all separatisms at the time. The Volts viewed Russian separatists as their quasi-essential allies. But when Yeltsin started acting in the separatist way, he didn't find many allies in Western Europe. In fact, we know that when he went to Strasbourg, he left it in half and puff. He was viewed as a dangerous demagogue. But he found hugely influential allies in the United States, primarily on the Republican right, which already at the time was the core of the Republican Party, and on the Democratic liberal left as well, where, you know, his vision, let's get rid of the totalitarian and an imperial, center, was highly popular. And in fact, given the presence of Baltic Americans, Ukrainian Americans, and other diasporas, could not even been seriously challenged. So this line, in a sense, presupposed what happened in 1991, when indeed, as Professor Varsori said, Gorbachev hoped to get a massive political, financial, and economic assistance to the Soviet Union, not to the Soviet Union on the past, but rather to the Union of the future, to his vision of this union of Eurasia being part of European and Western architecture of security. He discovered that Western leaders, Mitterrand, Andreotti, Kohl, who was grateful, of course, to Gorbachev hugely for his stand on Germany, and even Major, after Thatcher, supported him, but the leader of the West, the United States, opposed it. And what I found in the Bush Library and what I wrote in my book is the reasons why the United States opposed it, both because of the presence of diasporas, because of the prevalence of this vision that the Soviet Union and Russia should be, destroyed and dismantled, but also because of the issue, what would be the future of Russia in the world. I think there was much more fear of a future powerful union, aka Russia, than the Western Europeans had, ironically. It was what we call the Cheney line. Dick Cheney expressed it most clearly. The more parts of the Soviet Union would become independent, the smaller Russia would become, the better off we are. And this line essentially precluded the United States, Bush Sr., who was the president, from supporting the line, supporting massive help to Gorbachev. On the contrary, what I found that Bush and his team actively acted to suppress any dissent among Western Europeans who wanted to at least to give a promise of such, loose Marshall Plan to the Soviet Union. Americans came up with all kinds of excuses, mostly economic reasoning, that the Soviet Union was a mess anyway, and good money should not be poured into a rat hole. But ultimately, it was those fears of a future Russia and lack of trust in the prospect of a future Russia to be a peaceful pillar of the pan-European, pan-Atlantic security. And I think, and I've found some evidence for it, that the failure of Gorbachev to secure such unequivocal promise of help in the future, not immediately, but at some point in the future, could be a trigger that convinced the coup makers, that is Gorbachev's own ministers, including his own KGB leader, that you should save the Union by simply putting Gorbachev under house arrest. So when Gorbachev returned from London empty-handed, his entourage of ministers really had long faces. All the more, all the way to another huge question of NATO enlargement. It's a huge discussion, of course, and I side in this discussion with what Professor Sorotti wrote, and what she wrote in particular in her last book, Not 1 Inch. Sorotti is more cautious, however, than me. I think it's true to say that NATO enlargement at the time was not the primary and not the only reason for tipping the scale between what I call liberal imperialists, who viewed themselves, after all, as Russia as a pillar of Europe, not opposed to Europe, and more conservative imperialists, which essentially are around, in the most extreme form, around Putin today. The NATO enlargement, however, seriously tipped the balance at the time when it started. And I side with Mary when she said the manner in which NATO was enlarged, the timing of that enlargement, that is really quick, not giving any time to Russia to protest even. That was very, very important for the future story, for building a narrative of the post-Cold War Europe, playing into the hands of Russian conservatives in a really, really big way. And here, I'm, to this recent interesting exchange between Bill Clinton, who launched this type of enlargement, and Vladimir Putin. When Clinton recently said in his article in The Atlantic that actually I offered in clear language that Russia at some point would become a part of NATO. And Putin categorically denied it. He said, it was after the invasion of Ukraine, that I remember I was the last time when the last time I asked President Clinton, I just became Prime Minister of Russia, if Russia can become a member of NATO, and all I heard from Clinton was a long kind of mumbling answer, no answer at all. So. Somebody in this discussion must be wrong. And our instinct today is to say, of course, that Putin is a master of deception. But actually, the record is on his side. The United States never made a clear offer to Russia, aside from the founding act of 1997. And if you read the founding act, the language there is absolutely clear, that NATO's jurisdiction states that not in any way Russia can interfere in NATO's decision. That's meaning, above all, US leadership in NATO. I quote, NATO retains its full prerogatives. While Russia will work closely with NATO, it will not work within NATO. The act makes clear that Russia has no veto over alliance decisions, and NATO retains the right to act independently when it so chooses. So with this language, it's not, it shouldn't astonish anyone that when more conservative and suspicious members from security forces like Putin, gained ground. And Putin himself initially was not actually part of that group of conservatives. He sided with liberal imperialists. It's forgotten now. He tried to make personal friendship with Bush, with Blair, with other Western leaders. He counted on Russian tools, economic and political tools, to improve relationship with what Russia called the near abroad. What he discovered, however, that it was like two levels that didn't connect. the more Russian liberal imperialism succeeded economically, such as even in the Baltics and in Ukraine, the more hostility Russia encountered from the leaders of those states. And I'm not into this long discussion who's to blame. Of course, from the historically charged Baltic states and Poland and other countries, and in Ukraine, you hear one story. From Russia, you hear another story. But it takes two sides not only to tango but to quarrel, as we see. What's, however, interesting, and that this is I'm moving to Arne's questions. The reaction to the Soviet collapse. Do I have any regrets? Personally, no. But I would side with what Brent Scowcroft, Bush's quite realist national security advisor, wrote in a memorandum to the US president at some point. I think it was during the big discussion, what is in US interest? As some kind of loser union led by Gorbachev or someone else, or the breakup of the Union and in independent Russia, is that it would be better in the U.S. interests if Russia and Ukraine would stay in some kind of loser union, because without Ukraine, Russia would inexorably move in the direction of Russian imperialism, and this Russian imperialism would not be contained. Of course, Arne, I know what your students and you would say. Let's ask Ukrainians if they want it. But actually, at the time, Ukrainians were in many minds, in two minds. There were miles, were probably light years away from what is Ukraine today, single-mindedly opposed to any relationship with Russia. So yes, I think it's interesting and important from a history viewpoint to find that the collapse of the Union, no longer Soviet by that time in 1991, was not only opportunity for some, but also maybe a negative blow to the stability of the international system in the longer run. And that brings me to the Baltic, and I already began to say that, of course, I never in my book, I doubted that any movement for national liberation, if it's expressed peacefully and should be acknowledged. And from the Baltic states' perspective, that was an absolutely logical to appeal to the guys on a huge distant island. What's, however, astonishing in this story, and at least surprising in this story, is that the Russian democratic reformers believed that the United States and the West in general would be able to be more skillful and more delicate in meeting Baltic states' nationalism and vulnerabilities and sensibilities. Not only Baltic, of course, Polish, Czech, Romanian, whatnot, and at the same time understanding Russian realities. And for a while, it looked like the Clinton administration was determined to tread carefully and try to square the circle to meet both expectations. But increasingly, American policy began to shift in favor of the Lilliputians against the Gulliver. And they have, again, complicated reasons for it. But here we are. And most fatally, I think, at some point, a minority line that I call the Cheney line in Pentagon, but also in other branches of US government, gained currency, according to which it would be better for US interests if Ukraine and Russia are treated separately by the United States and the West. And this separation between Ukraine and the Russian Federation became not only a hidden, unofficial policy of the United States, even before Putin, I believe it happened. And then it was openly proclaimed when Putin reacted to it in a ham-fisted and increasingly threatening way. So it became a self self-fulfilling prophecy. Finally, very quickly on fascinating allusions to the 19th century and Arne's observation that we may find more lessons, more apt lessons before the Cold War. I applaud you, Arne, your decision never to write on the Cold War anymore. I have the same feeling myself. But what kind of instability we're facing today makes in Ukraine makes me really think not so much of the Korean War, but of the situation before World War I. And there are some loose but scary parallels between Russia and China today, and Austria-Hungary and Germany back then, when Russia being in Austria-Hungary. Today, with a weakening, not that it has ever been Austria-Hungary, but the analogy does rhyme. That it acts too much to China's surprise to turn up the apple cart of the international order. Maybe prematurely from China's perspective, but ultimately, yes, I agree with you, Arne. China has a field day today of buying Russian gas and oil, but also China, in a sense, faces new dangers. Because from China's perspective, and this is maybe my question to you, it would be a huge loss if Putin's regime and Russia as a state scuppers and goes down completely. That would mean that China, does not want to give Russia and never gave Russia any blank check as the Kaiser gave to the Austria-Hungary. But China would be much more in a bind than we even today ready to admit, to do something to save the junior sister. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Zubok, for these very interesting answers and also for widening the floor. So I think that maybe you both have to leave, I guess, Professor Zubok and Professor Westad. So I warmly thank you for joining us for this hybrid session. It was a pleasure to have you with us, even if in this way.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I can't get my camera on, but I want to thank you for the invitation.
Yes, thank you.
And also to thank Vlad for his answers. I would have loved to go to the pub and continue this discussion.
Thank you so much, and we are waiting for you here in person next
Absolutely.
time.
I wanted to end, almost like in the old Jewish saying, next time in Padova.
Definitely. Thank you to all of you. Thank you very much. And now we are going ahead with Professor Leopoldo Nuti, who is hopefully with us, I guess.
Hello, everybody.
Good morning, Professor Nuti. I'm going to introduce you and to leave immediately the floor, and maybe our IT service will work, just displaying also your video. So Professor Nuti is Professor of History of International Relations and coordinator of the International Studies section of the Doctoral School in Political Science at the Roma University. Professor Nuti has been a Fulbright student, NATO Research Fellow, Jean Monnet Fellow at the European University Institute, Research Fellow at the Harvard University, Senior Research Fellow at the Norwegian Nobel Institute, and Visiting Professor at the Institut d'études politiques in Paris. He has published extensively in Italian, English, French on US-Italian relations and Italian foreign security policy. And today we'll give a paper dealing with nuclear weapons from the Cold War to the new international order. Thank you for being with us, Professor Nuti. Very nice to see you, even if in this.
Thank you, Valentine. Thank you, and Antonio, for inviting me. It's been a pleasure to listen to the previous speakers and their quite interesting observations on the evolution of Chinese and Russian foreign policy. My duty today is to add something to this panel on the evolution of the international system from the Cold War to the post-Cold War period. And what I would like to do is to have a short discussion about the role of nuclear weapons in the end of the Cold War and in the aftermath of the Cold War. So I have two versions of my PowerPoint, a very long one and a very short one. Let me try to upload and share with you the short one. I'm not sure this is gonna work because I never use Zoom for sharing. So this could be an unmitigated disaster. Let me give it a try and see what happens. If it doesn't work,
maybe you can send the PPT to me or to the.
okay, that could be.
I will forward it to the IT service, so they will manage it.
Okay, because this will probably save us some time. Let me try to do that. It's gonna take a couple of minutes. I'm sorry. Maybe it's not worth it. Let me just go ahead.
Okay. As you wish.
No, I mean, I don't want to, abuse the patience of the audience while I'm trying to do this. It might take. Let me, if you can bear with me for about 1 minute and a half.
Yeah, sure.
I'll try to send
No
it to you, and then we'll see whether it works or not. Okay. Hello.
Professor Nuti, here we are, but I guess that you are solving the problem.
I just sent you the email, Valentine.
Okay. Okay.
The PowerPoint. I don't know if you can, if you receive
Yeah,
it.
now.
If you don't, if you can't, don't worry.
No. I'm going to fix it. Would you like? So I try to send it to the IT service because I don't have the control of the Zoom meeting. We have a service here. Now they should be able to. Michele, hai ricevuto la mail? Te l'ho mandata?
If not, I mean, let's get started. I mean, let's not abuse the patience of the audience.
No, I
here.
guess that
I know meetings online are a terrible thing.
Yeah, it's
I apologize for not being there. I have a very heavy teaching schedule these days, and I couldn't take off the whole day. I mean, it's really a serious disappointment not to be able to be in Padua, which, as you know, is a place I like very much. I also have some family connections there, so.
Yeah, we know. Now we are seeing you.
Okay, let's get started. So basically, what I want to do with this brief presentation is to add another element to the discussion we've had so far. And that is, what kind of nuclear age are we living in today? Is it still the old nuclear age? Are we living, as some historians or political scientists have written, are we living in a second nuclear age? And if we are, what are the features of this second nuclear age? Or as some more sophisticated analysts are actually writing, are we moving into a third nuclear age? So what happens to nuclear weapons at the end of the Cold War? We associate nuclear weapons with one of the permanent features of the Cold War, if you want. One of the elements of stability that created the conditions for the long peace, as Jean-Louis Gaddis wrote. What happened to them when the Cold War was over or came to an end? And what I'm going to do is divide my presentation into three short sections. One looking at the role nuclear weapons played at the end of the Cold War and in the transformation of the international system. Then look at the period between the end of the 1990s and the first decade of the new century, and how this was already quite different from the previous 10, 15 years. And then look at the last, more recent phase, what is commonly known as the return of great power competition, and what is the chance, what is the role that nuclear weapons are playing in such a phase. So three stretches of time, if you want, more or less a decade long each. Let's start with the first one. Nuclear weapons at the end of the Cold War. Here, I think the starting point is that we see a significant decline in the importance of nuclear weapons, and the process of arms control actually plays a central role in the transformation of the international system. The process of disarmament and arms control, to the point that some historians have called this the real golden age of arms control, even more than the 1970s and the period of detente. And one scholar that has written extensively on the history of nuclear weapons, Richard Rhodes, chose a very significant title for his last book of his 4-volume history of the nuclear age: The Twilight of the Bombs, the time when nuclear weapons are finally hopefully becoming irrelevant. There will be less and less on that. Yes, here we are. Thank you.
We managed to fix it.
These are my 3 sections. If you could quickly move through the next. Okay, these are some of the images I chose to give an idea of what happened at the end of the Cold War, the dismantling of the old B-52 bombers, which were associated with the threat of nuclear war, constantly circling around the Soviet Union. For anybody who has seen Dr. Strangelove, we know what we are talking about. If you could please move on to the next slide. We move on from a moment of maximum danger in which the doomsday clock of the Federation of American Scientists indicates 3 minutes to midnight in the early Reagan year. Next slide, please. We move on to the end of the Cold War, which 17 minutes to midnight when, and hold on a second, thank you. George Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev signed the START I treaty in 1991, and that looks like they're really setting the clock back, and the threat of nuclear war is eliminated. And if you could please move to the next slide, this is where we are today, 100 seconds to midnight. So have we gone back full circle to where we were 35, 40 years ago? Are we facing a danger of a nuclear war? That's one of the topic, the key topic of my talk, what I would like to talk about. Next slide, please. And this, in a way, is a reassuring chart that shows you that throughout the Cold War, there was a constant rise in the number of nuclear weapons and the precipitous decline in the final phase of the Cold War and afterwards. Next slide, please. Okay, so to the first phase of my talk. The last years of the Cold War and the early post-Cold War years. So a dramatic sequence of breakthroughs in the process of arms control and disarmament. First, you had the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty in December 1987, which for the first time in history completely abolished an entire class of nuclear weapons, the intermediate range forces with a range of 500 to 5,500 kilometers, the so-called Euro missiles. Then you had the START I treaty in the summer of 1991, which for the first time reduced the number of strategic weapons in the arsenal of both the Soviet Union and the United States. August 1991, when there was a serious danger of collapse of the entire Soviet Union, the Bush administration started this series of the so-called presidential nuclear initiatives, as they saw that there was no time to develop another bilateral agreement for the reduction of the Soviet strategic arsenal and tactical arsenal. The Bush administration unilaterally decided to reduce the American arsenal, hoping that Gorbachev would imitate what Bush was doing. So a number of completely unexpected dramatic breakthroughs took place in the last few months of 1991. And at the same time, as the US was unilaterally reducing a number of its tactical nuclear weapons, the US Senate launched the Non-Lugar Act to help the Soviet government control its nuclear weapons in its entire structure of nuclear facilities. In the next 4 years, the US provided $400 million a year to the Soviet Union and then Russia to control and dismantle its nuclear arsenal. While all of this was taking place, this completely unexpected cooperation between the two countries, something entirely new and fascinating took place. Beginning of a close cooperation and exchange of visits between the scientists of the nuclear laboratories of the two countries. People from Los Alamos went to Semipalatinsk. The physicists who had built weapons to destroy each other over the past 40 years, all of a sudden exchanged visits, exchanged technologies, talked to each other, opened up a dialogue. So it really looked as if the Cold War was not only coming to an end, but a completely new relationship was being forged. And this climaxed with START II, signed in the very last few days of the Bush administration in January 1993, which was meant to open up yet another further reduction of the strategic arsenals of both countries. And while this was going on, the two superpowers were reducing their nuclear arsenals, NATO was transforming itself from an alliance which had basically created its own security and defense identity on nuclear deterrence, on an alliance in which nuclear weapons were defined as weapons of last resort, something that could be truly weapons of last resort, is what the London Declaration of 1990 says. And the new strategic concept that was approved in 1991 clearly removed the importance of nuclear weapons to a very limited role in the alliance strategy. So the whole architecture of the Cold War was being transformed, and nuclear weapons, which had played a central role in the relationship between the two superpowers, in defining the security architecture of the two blocs, were removed to a very marginal role. And at the same time, around this bilateral transformation of the American-Soviet/Russian nuclear relationship, a new nuclear order was being created. If you could please move to the next slide. Yes, okay. This whole process of marginalization of nuclear weapons was not taking place just in Europe, but it was a broader one. At the same time, in the early 1990s, South Africa, which had developed its own small nuclear arsenal, completely destroyed it, being the first time that a nuclear country completely cancelled and destroyed its nuclear arsenal and reverted to a non-nuclear status. It was a small arsenal, 6.5 nuclear bombs, as the history tells us, as the history of South Africa tells us. But it's still, it's a significant step. No other country had ever done anything like that before. And at the same time, and this is important also in regard to what Professor Zubok was telling us before, 3 countries that had inherited a large part of the Soviet nuclear arsenal, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, renounced, not entirely spontaneously, their Soviet nuclear legacy and gave what they had to Russia. And something that is not often remembered here is that the United States played a significant role in helping out Russia become the sole successor of the Soviet Union in terms of inheriting its nuclear arsenal. So Ukraine had at the time, when it gave up its nuclear weapons, the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world, right after the US, Russia, and then there was Ukraine. So it is, again, a significant accomplishment towards a reduced visibility and importance of nuclear weapons. In the same direction, you have more significant steps. The first North Korean nuclear crisis is solved thanks to the contribution of President Carter in October 1994, after the International Agency for Atomic Energy has discovered that North Korea had a secret enrichment nuclear program, and that the question is resolved somehow with this agreement. We know that this solution would not last, but at this time, this is regarded as a significant success. And then you have three extremely important steps in stabilizing the global nuclear order. First of all, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which had a limited, which was going to last only until 1995, is extended indefinitely as something which was by no means a preordained conclusion. It was actually something that was heavily contested. And through a number of very skillful diplomatic maneuvers, the United States manages to persuade a number of countries to accept the indefinite extension of the NPT. So a treaty with a limited duration is now granted an indefinite extension. And finally, in 1996, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty is signed, a success which had escaped all previous attempts to forever ban all nuclear tests. And if, as this was not enough, the International Agency for Atomic Energy introduces the additional protocol the following year, in which inspectors of the agency are given much more power than in the past to verify that members of the NPT are actually respecting the safeguards and guarantees and are not secretly developing nuclear weapons. So as you can see, the dismantling of the bilateral nuclear confrontation, which had been the key feature of the Cold War, is only part of a broader attempt of denuclearize the world, if you want, and build a global nuclear order in which arms control, disarmament, inspections are a permanent feature in order to make the world a better and safer place. Does this attempt continue in the next few years? If you could please move to the next slide. The second period, and I'll promise I'll be very brief because I know I'm taking up a lot of time. The second period lasts roughly another 10, 15 years. And here you have signs that, yes, there is progress in the direction of reducing the importance of nuclear weapons, but there are also signs that point in an opposite direction. Not all countries are happy about the idea of putting a cap on the circulation of nuclear weapons. And the first clear evidence that this is the case happens in May 1998, when two countries that had constantly been developing their nuclear programs, India and Pakistan, finally burst into the open and carry out a series of nuclear tests. India first and Pakistan immediately afterwards, becoming officially nuclear countries, having tested openly their nuclear, a variety of nuclear devices, refusing to accept the CTBT, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, still outside of the NPT, and in a way, questioning the progress that had been carried out in the previous 10 years when arms control and disarmament had clearly achieved so many successes. And the Indian and Pakistani tests strengthened those forces in the United States that opposed the ratification of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Particularly, there is a section in the Republican Party which is strongly opposed to the Clinton administration's effort to ratify the CTBT. There is also a very close relationship with the whole process of the Clinton impeachment due to the Levinsky scandal. The Republican Party does not want to grant an easy success to the Clinton administration. The Clinton administration, on the other hand, handles the whole procedure of building up a majority to ratify the treaty in the Senate very poorly. And so when the bill comes to the Senate in October 1999, a majority, there is a very, very slim majority to ratify the treaty, and the Clinton administration does not succeed in expanding this majority, and eventually the treaty is not ratified, which is a milestone in this process we have been discussing. All of a sudden, the key promoter of all these measures of arms control and disarmament backs down and fails to ratify the treaty. And since the treaty will only enter into force if a number of key countries ratify it, the failure of the United States marks is a disaster for this whole process. So this new period clearly shows that the progress achieved in the previous 10, 15 years might not continue. There are some other steps forward. The Russian Duma, which had refused to ratify the START II treaty for a number of reasons. There is no time to go into that, but I would be happy to talk about it if there is time later on. Eventually ratifies the START II treaty, which had been signed in 1993. And then when the US announces that it will withdraw its support for the anti-ballistic missile treaty that had been signed in 1992, the Duma withdraws its own ratification. So START II never enters into force. Again, another major blow to the arms control architecture of the previous years. The Bush administration and Putin tried to mend fences by signing the SORT treaty shortly afterwards, which somehow hopes to relaunch the process of arms control. Yet at the same time, there are more nuclear crises opening up between 2003 and 2006. North Korea and Iran are caught secretly developing their nuclear facilities to build up their nuclear programs. And so two more crises all burst into the open. And by 2006, North Korea will test its first nuclear weapon, openly define the arms control architecture. Faced with this decline in the progress of the previous years, a number of key figures try to relaunch the process of arms control. The so-called four horsemen, two former secretaries of state, Henry Kissinger and Schultz, former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry, Senator Sam Nunn. These four major figures in the US establishment publish an article in which they call for not just arms control, but complete disarmament, to create a world free of nuclear weapons. And these are not your radical pacifists. We are talking about Henry Kissinger or Bill Perry, former Secretary of Defense, the head of the Pentagon. So this clearly has a major impact on US public opinion. They hope to relaunch a process that has stalled to a certain extent. And when Obama becomes president, he gives this speech in Prague in the early months of his administration, in which he basically clearly advocates the creation of a world free of nuclear weapons. The first time that a US president openly pledges to move in this direction and declares this to be a goal of US foreign policy. So, and this becomes, I mean, the first step in this direction is the New START treaty, which Obama signs in 2010 with the successor of President Putin, Medvedev. So as you can see here, there are basically two different trends emerging. A difficult attempt to continue the progress towards the construction of, if not a nuclear-free world, a reduced role for nuclear weapons in the international system, and an emerging number of difficulties. The dialogue between the US and Russia is not stalling, but it's proceeding much more slowly than in the previous years. And a number of countries are constantly challenging all this. And then if we could please move to the next and final slide, we'll come to an end. Basically, since the war in Libya in 2011 and have collapsed, particularly the INF treaty has been abandoned by both NATO, the United States, and Russia. The limited success of the solution of the Iranian nuclear crisis with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action has been dismantled by the Trump administration. North Korea has continued to test its nuclear weapons and to challenge the global nuclear order. And China and Russia have increasingly modernized their nuclear forces. So are we back to where we were 30 years ago? How do we define this very uncertain phase in the history of the nuclear age? If we look back at that graph that we saw at the beginning of my presentation, the number of weapons has not increased. We are still numerically in a much better shape than we ever were throughout the Cold War. Clearly, so at least for the time being. What is dramatically changed is that the language with which great powers talk about nuclear weapons has returned to a tone that we had not seen since the last days of the Cold War, since the last few years of the 1980s. If you look at the American nuclear strategy of 2018, they openly talk of the return of great power competition. If you look at the Russian nuclear strategy of 2015, they put an emphasis on the modernization of nuclear arsenals, the role of deterrence, the importance of nuclear weapons. So the assumption that there would be an uninterrupted progress towards arms control is constantly being challenged. and it's being challenged in two different ways. You know, in the world of arms control, analysts always talk about vertical proliferation and horizontal proliferation. And the problem here is that you don't have just the vertical proliferation, or because that is somewhat limited in numerical terms. It is also challenged horizontally by the multiplication of countries that are trying to develop their own nuclear arsenal, challenging the idea that nuclear weapons are something that belongs to the West. There is something post-colonial, if you want, in the Indian, Pakistani, Korean attempts to develop their nuclear arsenals, and perhaps in the Iranian one. So I put a question mark at the end of the question because we don't really know what impact the current events will have on the development of nuclear weapons and their proliferation and their role in the international system. But clearly, it's not going to be a good one. And I'll stop here, and I apologize for talking for too long.
Thank you so much, Professor Nuti. I'm very happy that also we managed to share your PowerPoint presentation, which was very clear and interesting indeed. Now, I immediately leave the floor and introduce Professor Antonio Varsori, who is full professor of History of International Relations, who was also former director of the Department of Political Sciences, Law and International Studies, and was also for a long while a member of the Academic Senate of the University of Padua. He is president of the Liaison Group of Contemporary European Historians at the European Commission. He was president of the Italian Society of International History for 2 terms, and he is currently member of the Scientific Committee or Editorial Committee of the journals Cold War History, Journal of European Integration History, Storia Diplomazia, Eunomia, Res Publica. Since 2015, he has been director of the magazine Ventunesimo Secolo, and he's also member of the committee for the publication of the Italian diplomatic documents at the Italian Foreign Ministry. And he just published a very important book, kind of milestone of history of international relations, Dalla rinascita al declino, storia internazionale dell'Italia repubblicana, for the publishing house Il Mulino. Today, he will discuss the paper, The European Union from the Illusion of a Leading Role in the Post-Cold War International Order to the Hard Reality of the Multipolar System. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Valentine, and well, it's a pleasure to be here and to give this paper. Well, I have some, not exactly slides, you know, but just photos, you know, just in order not to bore you too much, you know, with the written slides, you know, because I always think that sometimes images, you know, photos are more important than words. In spite of that, I'm not going to read, you know, this paper. Well, the fall of the Berlin Wall came as a surprise to both the political leaders and the public opinions of the European community, at the time the so-called Europe of the 12. While the reaction of the public opinion was usually a positive one, as the perspective of the end of the Cold War were perceived as the end of the nuclear confrontation, the leaders of the major member states, from Margaret Thatcher to François Mitterrand to Giulio Andreotti, were worried about both the reemerging of a powerful unified Germany and the collapse of a European balance that had implied the longest period of peace in Europe. The early solution to the quick German reunification and the collapse of the Cold War order, as it was envisaged by the leaders of the European community, was based on 3 main pillars. First, the strengthening of the European integration. Second, the survival of NATO, which meant the survival of the close transatlantic relationship. And third, a new European balance based on the involvement of the Soviet Union and the post-communist states in the former Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, which will be quickly transformed into the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And yeah, I hope it works. Let's see if it does not work. Sì, that's okay. Okay, well, you see just some photos that follow the Berlin Wall, the Trabant, Germans from the East, and there's two cartoons which, in my opinion, are very amusing, you know, about the German reunification. You know, on the left, you see François Mitterrand who is speaking with Chancellor Kohl, essayer quand même de garder un profil bas, which was a bit difficult because, of course, Kohl was very big, you know, tall, and Mitterrand was not so tall. And on the right, you see a cartoon about Margaret Thatcher, and the husband of Margaret Thatcher say, well, please, Maggie, it's not the situation of the Second World War, you know. That was, you know, a shelter of the Second World War, you know, when the Germans bombed London, you know. So, and well, and of course, this is the photos of the German reunification later, you know. Well, in 1989, the strengthening of the European integration was already in progress, although it had been merely conceived as an economic process. That is the creation of a great single unified market, the European Economic and Monetary Union, based on the four mobilities, goods, capital, services, individuals, as it had been shaped in the famous White Book of the Delors Commission in 1985. An early reaction by the European community to the emerging economic globalization and the neoliberal turn. In the meantime, a tiny group of economists, central bankers, and high officials from the European Commission had already started a debate about the creation of a European currency, a goal which had been approved, though in vague terms, by the Madrid European Council in 1988. In the opinion of the supporters of the European integration, the creation of a single European currency was not only an economic goal, but it will be a political instrument that will become a booster to the creation of a supranational Europe. The perspective of German reunification strengthened the project for the creation of a European currency, as Mitterrand hoped that the achievement of such an objective, which would imply the merging of the Deutschmark into a future European currency, would already closely tie a reunified Germany to the European community and safeguard France's leading political role in the community itself. On its part, the Italian government put forward some proposal for a closer political integration. The outcome of the two intergovernmental conferences, which took place in 1991, led to the signature of the Maastricht Treaty. The main achievement of this agreement was the implementation of the Economic and Monetary Union, with the perspective of the creation in a decade of the single European currency, the euro, and of the independent European Central Bank. Furthermore, the community will transform itself into the European Union, EU, with the overt ambition of becoming also a relevant international actor through the common foreign and security policy. So the European Union will be able to speak with one voice and to play an influential role in the post-Cold War international order. There were just some photos about the new Russian leader, Boris Yeltsin, and this was an image of an electoral campaign by Boris Yeltsin dancing, you know, in a theater. This, on the contrary, there are more serious persons. One is not well known, you know, well, it's well known by the Italians, which is Tommaso Padua Schioppa. And of course, he was one of the advisors of Jacques Delors. Jacques Delors was the chairman of the European Commission. And we may say that both Padua Schioppa and Jacques Delors were the two persons who created, you know, the idea and the project for a common European currency. So there is just one first problem. The common European currency was not the, you know, the organization, the achievement of some political leaders or some political parties, but, you know, but to bureaucrats, you know, to officials. And we'll see that in this period, it was not a problem, but it will become a problem later on. But we come to another aspect, you know. By early 1992, in the aftermath of the Maastricht Treaty, Western leaders and opinion makers believed that the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of communism, and of the Cold War will be at the origins of a new international order. It was the period of the big optimistic mood about the new international order, the 1990s. Yeah. Such a new international system will be characterized by some relevant factors. The leading role played by the United States, the only superpowers left due to the American victory in the Cold War. You see how interpretation changed very quickly in a few years. B, the new important role which will be played by the United Nations and other multilateral organizations such as NATO, the European Union, the OSCE, in maintaining and solving local conflict. The right to intervene in the internal affairs of a state if human rights were threatened. That was completely new. It didn't exist, before the 1990s. It was the big period, of the human rights. And C, the complete and successful achievement of a neoliberal international economic system, which will favor the worldwide spreading of liberal values and Western-oriented democratic regime. The idea, if China is globalizing, is becoming a democracy. You see that things went in a different way. This is Francis Fukuyama, and it's the book, The End of History and the Last Man, which appeared in 1992. It was very famous at that time. This is, of course, the logo of the court, International Court for Rwanda, and the other, the seat of the Penal International, Criminal International Court. So, and these were two main actors, of the period of the optimistic mood, on the 1990s, Bill Clinton and his wife, Hillary Rodham Clinton. You see, there is very optimistic photo, They're young, smiling, smart, everything, So, well, which was the European Union position in the new international order, which was mainly based on the United States as the only superpower left. Well, the immediate post-Maastricht Treaty was not an easy period, as it was proved by events such as the difficulties related to the ratification process, a negative economic period, the decay of some political leadership, especially Mitterrand and Kohl, the economic and social problems that Germany had to face due to a rapid reunification. Moreover, the early test of the European Union ambition of playing an influential international role, that is the attempt at dealing with the collapse of Yugoslavia and the ensuing civil wars, proved to be a complete failure. Due to the weakness of the common foreign and security policy and the division among the member states about the attitude towards the various former Yugoslav nations, in spite of these setbacks, in a few years, the mood in the European Union dramatically changed and an optimistic outlook prevailed. There were several reasons at the base of such a radical development, and I am going to list, this reason, which really shaped the second half of the 1990s, Of course, for your generation, it means not too much, It means very much for my generation. I lived, this period personally. Well, first was the world economic situation improved, and there was a growing faith in the positive consequence of the globalization process. Globalization is going to become, to transform everybody as a rich, person. The European Monetary Union appeared to work well, and European leaders, opinion makers, European officials became strong advocates of the globalization and its ideals, as well as the European Union role in a globalized world. The transatlantic relationship appeared to be strengthened by the emergence of liberal, in the American way, liberal leadership in the European Union member state. Tony Blair in the United Kingdom, Romano Prodi in Italy, Gerhard Schröder in Germany, socialists or social democrats or liberal, which claimed to share common values with the United States administration of President Bill Clinton. The quick and successful enlargement to Finland, Sweden, and Austria, which was achieved very quickly, just a few years, and these three countries became full members of the European Union. The starting of the negotiation with the states from East Central Europe, which had applied to the full membership, and the clear progress in the process of democratization in Central European states, such as Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and the Baltic nations. the progress in the creation of the future common currency, the implementation of some policies which had an easy and positive impact on the citizens of the member states, mainly the Erasmus project. The Erasmus project was the real success, of the European Union, in the 1990s. And moreover, the success stories in the process of economic and social development of some member states, especially the case of Spain. Spain in the 1970s was a backward right-wing country's a dictatorship. In 15 years became, the symbol, of Movida, Barcelona, and so on and so on. A nice place where students from Europe choose to go for Erasmus, because it was, smart going to Spain in that period. And the attempt by the European Commission to create a European identity through the European flag, the European hymn, and so on and so on, something which did not exist before, so something was a change, And it must point out this aspect, the creation of influential European pressure groups and elites, academics, intellectuals, members of the media, diplomats, local, national, and European top civil servants, lobbyists involved in the European project, which meant that in the 1990s, there were more money in Brussels, more money, more opportunity, more lobbyists, and more persons tied to the future of the European Union. Of course, if you want money, the European Union had to survive and to strengthen its position. On the contrary, there will be no money at all for you. So don't forget these aspects which were in this period, in my opinion, very important. On the morrow of the creation of the European Union, the future of the European Union appeared bright. And the European Union seemed to be one of the pillars with the United States of the new liberal and capitalist international order. Think that 4 members of the G8, G8 was also with Russia, and Russia was the poor relative, so J7. And so 4 members of the J7 were members of the European Union. And the European Union was one of the wealthiest and more advanced and peaceful areas of the world. So everything appeared very, I would say, very bright, for the European Union. This is a very nice photo, because you see there are Bill Clinton and Donald Trump and Hillary Rodham and, Donald Trump's wife when they smile together. Later on, they had some problems, in their relationship. And of course, this is the question of former Yugoslavia. And this is the change, from Yeltsin to Putin, And Putin in 1999 looked very timid. He looked very cautious, just a minor bureaucrat, He changed a bit, later on. And this, is some example of the European Union of the 1990s, the flag, this a bit silly, symbols, this sort of puppet, so. And there's a Spain of the 1990s, Manuel Vázquez Montalbán. Nobody knows who was, now. My students ignore who is Manuel Vázquez Montalbán. But please try to remember that Montalbano came from Manuel Vázquez Montalbán, but everybody forgot it. And also Pedro Almodóvar. I hope that you know who he is. This is the signature of the Amsterdam Treaty, 1997. Nice day in Amsterdam. All the members of the European Union, all smiling, or everybody is very happy. And this is Cool Britannia, Tony Blair. And Tony Blair, when he came to Downing Street, he gave a party, and of course it was very informal, and he was speaking with, I think, is a sort of pop star. I forgot the name. And that's some symbol of Cool Britannia, so using that's on the contrary is Romano Prodi, and it's the victory of the olive tree, and you see the olive tree. It was the Italian flag, but it was especially the European flag. So Italy was entering Europe, and as it was said in that period. That's something about globalization, but we'll see later on. Well, I will point out anyway this photo because this is one of the consequences of globalization. Is the Fiat becoming Fiat Chrysler Automobile Group, And you see that Fiat is building cars, not only in Italy, but, somewhere else, in Argentina, in Brazil, in Mexico, in Serbia, in Poland, and so on. It's a consequence of globalization. So you can delocalize, and so you can build factories everywhere. There is no need to have Fiat cars, built only in Italy. Well, and that's another aspect of globalization. This is just only 2005, and the People's Republic of China nominal gross domestic product increased. And you see, it's becoming that in that way. So of course, we come to September 11. September 11 and the terrorist attack to the Twin Towers came as a dramatic shock to the Western world, and in a few hours swept away all the hopes in a peaceful international order based on Western values, which had characterized the previous decade. As an early reaction, the European Union and its member states appear to share the position of the US administration in the struggle against international terrorism. Actually, in about 2 years, the European Union attitude, or better, the position of some leading member states, of the Commission and of influential Europeanist elite, radically changed. Between 2001 and 2003, it became evident that the Bush administration took profit from the war on terror to strengthen a United States world leadership. Hard power will take the place of the soft power of the Clinton administration. Unilateralism will supersede a multilateral approach. The creation of a new Middle East and the ambition and the sparking Western democracy, also for war, became relevant goals of the US administration. The increasing tension between Washington and Saddam Hussein will lead in 2003 to the American invasion of Iraq. This new approach to the international system was negatively perceived by both the European Union and some influential Western European leaders, especially the French President Jacques Chirac and the German Chancellor Schröder. France, Germany, and the European Union, or at least the Commission and the European elite, became the advocates of a new relevant role of the European Union and the advocate of an international order in competition with the American one, which will be based on multilateralism, diplomacy, the role of the United Nations, respect of both international law and human rights, the rejection of the clash of civilization in favor of dialogue with the Islamic world. Such an ambition will lead to the concept of the European Union as a civilian power, to the existence of two competing Western actors, on one hand, the US, UK, on the other, European Union, and to the spreading of the European Union values on a worldwide basis. Politicians, intellectuals, opinion makers, European bureaucrats such as Habermas, Strauss-Kahn, James Rifkin, in continental Europe argued that the contrast between the United States and the European Union, as well as the strong European pacifist movement, will create the core of a strong European identity. That will become a point of reference in a worldwide perspective. It was an illusion, but it was a widespread illusion for a few years. This period was characterized by a publication of hundreds, if not thousands, articles and books on these issues, both in Europe and the United States. This was the first reaction to the September 11 in the Repubblica and the Corriere della Sera, attacco all'America e alla civiltà, attacco all'America. This was the symbol of the euro, the tower in Frankfurt of the European Central Bank. This is a very interesting, about the cartoon about the enlargement, say, no longer Eastern Europe, but just Europe, everybody happy about that, This was something which I can. Such an optimistic view of the international role of the European Union was strengthened by some contemporary events, which were perceived by European decision makers and the European elites as definite and important achievements in the integration process. First of all, starting with the 1st January 2002, the euro became the currency of 12 member states of the EU. The European Central Bank was created under the chairmanship of the Dutch Duisenberg, and other member states quickly applied to become members of the Eurozone. The creation of the euro was regarded as a paramount success, an economic but also political goal which had been achieved in spite of several obstacles and of previous pessimistic forecasts by numerous US economists and analysts who appear to fear the emergence of a powerful competitor to the dollar. In December 2002, on the occasion of the Laeken European Council, the European leaders launched the project in order to draw up a constitutional treaty, which will aim at strengthening the supranational character of the European Union. In the same period, the European Union, also owing to the position developed by the European Commission chaired by Romano Prodi, decided in favor of the so-called Big Bang, the quick and most important enlargement of the European Union. In 2004, 10 nations, mainly former communist countries, will become full members of the Union. 3 years later, they will be followed by Romania and Bulgaria. Last but not least, if during the 1990s, the United States was defined as the only superpower left, in the early 2000s, foreign policy pundits began to write scholarly articles and ponderous books on the decline of the American empire and the role of the emerging countries, the BRIC or BRICS. Such a development, however, did not appear to worry the European Union, which thought that Russia, India, Brazil, China would be mainly economic actors with which the European Union will develop positive relations. Only after a few years, the European Union leaders will discover that some BRIC, especially Russia and China, were not emerging, but re-emerging empires with global ambitions, and they will not identify themselves with the vision and values of the European Union. I don't want to bother you too much, and I am going to close, my paper, and I will just point out that this illusion, these hopes, quickly disappear in a few years, especially as a consequence of the economic crisis of 2007-2008 and the following crisis of the sovereign debt of 2010-2011. And in my opinion, there was a third period, in the history of the European Union, a more pessimistic, more inward-looking period after, the illusion of being part of the new international order of the 1990s, the illusion of being a civilian power, after September 11, and the European Union began to face a series of problems, and I don't want to go into detail, and I will just to list, which were these problems. First of all, the question of the economic crisis, which hit some countries, the famous pigs or pigs. The problem was Italy is part of the pigs or not. Obviously Italy was part of the pigs, so it was pigs with 2 I. And as it was demonstrated in 2010-2011. And what mattered, in my opinion, was that it was a really change of attitude among the some important social strata of the European society. Till the early 2000s, the common idea of most European voters or European citizens was, okay, we know that there are somebody in Brussels who take decisions. We don't know what they are doing. It's very difficult, very complicated. They say, no, please don't worry, make us work. We know, you don't know. There was a sort of undeclared agreement. We'll leave you working. Okay, so the bureaucrats work. And we don't know what they're doing. There is a sort of trade-off. We know that the European Union is giving us something which is important, economic progress, and in case of crisis, the survival of welfare state. The Greek crisis changes that attitude, austerity, cuts in welfare state, cuts in wage, unemployment, and so on, and everything changed. So there was a different attitude towards the European Union. The European Union is not defending the poor and the weaker strata of the society. I don't say that it was true or not, but this was the perception. And so the beginning of what we later on call sovereignism or, Euroscepticism, etc., the rejection of the European Union, the rejection of the Europe of the bankers, Europe of the bureaucrats, and so on and so on. The other question was the migration crisis, which had a strong impact once again, on the attitude of several European societies. What is doing the European Union to solve this problem? Not too much. Of course, it would be easy to say that question of migration doesn't, it's not a problem for the European Union, because usually it's national policies, But it's very easy to say, well, Brussels is doing nothing, So Brussels is the responsible for that. And later on, I think there was another question, which was, the decline of some political leadership in Western Europe. And so, in my opinion, the problem for the European Union after 2007, 2008 was that it was too much focusing its attention on its problems, without taking into consideration that the world was changing and that the international balance was changing, and that there were new actors, more powerful, more assertive, in the international context. I completely agree with the idea of an international system, a multipolar international system, which is composed by 5, 6 big powers competing among themselves and making use of power politics, which means political means, economics, and also military means, if they think it's the way to defend their national interest, as we are witnessing now. So just for a few further, this was the reaction to the war in Iraq, to the war, and this was a very famous book by Jeremy Rifkin, a sociologist, The European Dream, who is superseding the American dream, and Europe is the new dream, without forgetting that there was China, India, and Russia, which were coming out, And this was another stupid book, on the by Robert Kagan, the famous book, Europeans come from Venus and Americans come from Mars, and so on, and we spend a lot of time. This was the rejection of the constitutional treaty, some stereotypes, and I don't know why, the French must have a baguette, about something like that, but anyway, this, the rejection of the constitutional treaty, in France, and this was a new leader, Angela Merkel, definitely younger, than now. And this, the Lehman Brothers collapse, and, this was the brokers, people working in Lehman Brothers were coming out, the building with boxes with their, with everything, There's some cartoons about the pigs, very amusing, I would say, Italy is the last, and the pigs, there is also the Italian pig, and there's, something about, the solution to the Greek crisis, which was very useful for German bank. And there's two cartoons, about Germany and the Mediterranean countries, I mean, especially the one is very amusing, you are having a coffee, and the symbol of the euro is becoming like more or less, something of the German Third Reich, which is a bit too strong, in my opinion. This is when Mario Monti became president of the council, and so see, it's austerity, and of course the poor Italian putting, money and so on. And of course, there's something about what happened, outside Europe, because one of the problems was that we were focusing more on our problems, forgetting what was happening, outside, outside Europe. I mean, very near to Europe. This is, very amusing, about Putin and the Matryoshka. And this is with the China real gross, product growing in 1980. You see, 2019 it was only 6.1%, only 6. you know. And of course, it was, you know, the Olympic Games in Beijing in 2008, which is, you know, a show of power, in my opinion. You know, Olympic Games are also, there's just something about Ukraine, and you know, this is a very, very nice, in my opinion, cartoon. Plans after Crimea. Well, Alaska was part of Russia. Yeah, so, no, but of course, you know, this was the migration crisis and terrorism, and well, of course, it is. I found this very amusing. You know, it's Mario Draghi when he was still president of the European Central Bank, and of course, it is Christine Lagarde when he was responsible for international monetary funds. And as I always say, there is a lab which is started clearly, you know, and unluckily this is the last photos, you know, and the question and the final remarks, you know, and I am going to conclude. I'm so sorry, perhaps it was too long, you know. I think that the war in Ukraine appears to be a dramatic symbol of the radical change in the international system. It is too early to draw any conclusion for the war in Ukraine. It is a conflict between the West and Russia, or is a conflict between the United States and Russia. Will Russia be weakened and isolated between a renewed cordon sanitaire? Is it true, as it's proposed by the European Union rhetoric, that the whole world condemns Russia? What about China? What about India? What about Brazil and the Islamic world and Africa? I think that we forget that the world is not longer the world of the 1980s. The world of the 1980s was the world of the J7 and the Soviet Union, of the communist bloc, if you think. Now the world is something more complex and more complicated, and I would say also more dangerous, you know. And with these 5-6 actors competing among themselves. And I am very worried. I was no worried like today, also during the Cold War period. And the idea that everybody, and of course I have some questions to my friend and colleague Leopoldo Nuti, I am really struck by the fact that we came back to speak about atomic bombs. You know, we forgot the nuclear bombs. You know, we forgot for a long period. You know, we discussed about atomic bombs in the 1980s or the Cold War period, and for some years we forgot it. You know, it was a question, you know, for specialists and so on and so on. You know, and now, you know, politicians, they speak about the nuclear power and nuclear bomb. You know. And it's really worrying. And in my opinion, I would say that the goal, one of the main tasks of the European Union, will be to take a position, you know, and to try to think that we must not speak about atomic bomb, you know, any longer, because atomic bomb means the end of everything, of everybody. So sorry about that, you know, to conclude with this rhetoric and moralistic view, but, you know, it's a bit difficult, you know, to say, well, we are historians, we'll just look to the past and we are not interested in what is happening today. You know, sorry about that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Varsori, even if you ended up with this quite pessimistic view about the present day. So unfortunately, Professor Nuti just left because is quite yeah, but just a couple of minutes ago, so he was able to follow your intervention. So I'm opening the floor for a few minutes, I guess, because I think that the time is running out, so everybody is quite tired, but still this session was very impressive, I must say, and also groundbreaking to a certain point of view. So I'm asking you if you have any question. Thank you. Would you like to come here?
Okay, so good afternoon, and I actually had two questions, one for Professor Nuti, one for Professor Varsori, but I will ask rhetorically my question to Leopoldo Nuti as just some food for thought, and perhaps maybe Professor Romellini or Professor Varsori want to maybe spend a few words on that. So my general idea is that perhaps the story that we have heard this afternoon is also partly a story of missed opportunities. To Professor Nuti, I would have liked to ask whether there was actually any real chance for nuclear disarmament or total dismantlement of nuclear weapons, because I was quite struck by hearing that it was only in 2009 that Obama was the first president of the United States to claim for a total dismantlement of nuclear weapons. So perhaps it was this lack of clear intention towards dismantlement in the early 1990s that established a unipolar system which was very much imbalanced and which was giving too much power to just one side of the, the international system, and that is the United States, and therefore created a condition for a new military nuclear escalation in the late 1990s. So what I was asking myself, perhaps rhetorically, was whether there was actually any chance for nuclear disarmament, even in the 1990s, where, despite this very optimistic period that Professor Varsori described so well. And my second question to Professor Varsori is whether if he agrees with the thesis by Marisa Roth that there was actually a missed chance. This is the very thesis that was also discussed by Professor Zubok earlier this afternoon, whether there was a real missed chance to create a stable European architecture after the end of the Cold War. Because it seems to me that the European Union was actively engaged in building its common currency, in proposing itself as a civilian power, in launching initiatives, cultural initiatives, identity initiatives, and so on and so forth, but perhaps neglecting the big question, that is the balance of power in Europe. So perhaps it was missing the core issue for the stability of the European continent. And now we are like waking up all in a sudden, seeing that there is not a stable European order, or there are not the conditions for a stable order. So it seems to me that perhaps there was a missed chance to build this sort of stable European architecture.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So I will add a question if I can. To Professor Varsori. So I wonder if you agree with this assessment, which, I mean, we can say that the European Union managed to create a European identity over the last decades, thanks to the common coin and to the Erasmus flows that you mentioned. So it was able to create a common identity in civil society, but still diplomacy follows different paths. So regarding that, I wonder what is the role of France, for example, because actually France was always on the edge of the, dealing with diplomacy. And I'm wondering if Emmanuel Macron is going to follow a more national-based foreign policy now that he has been re-elected. And so he is, more powerful to a certain extent, rather than asking, as it was mentioned this morning, the possibility to modify the European treaties, and then so probably making also the European Union stronger than it is today.
Well, not so easy. Well. First of all, I would like to say something about the question to my colleague Leopoldo, because it was one of the questions which I would like to pose him. So in my opinion, nuclear weapons are still important from a political viewpoint. I'm not speaking now, about these weeks or this month. If you think about the 1990s or the beginning of the 21st century, what about North Korea, for example? What about Iran? Do you think that North Korea will be able to play the role which is playing without being a nuclear power? I would think not. Everybody fear. We don't know what is they are going to do. They have a nuclear bomb, so it's better, to try to find out some form of compromise. Do you think that France will be able to play the leading role in the European Union without being a nuclear power? I think not. Obviously, France is also a permanent member of the Security Council, of the United Nations, which is important. So I think that being a nuclear power, also with a few bombs, it's enough to have a few bombs. I was very. I thought that I am going to tell him, to Leopoldo, say, well, there is something positive, there was no increasing number of nuclear weapons, Okay, we know that very few, they are enough to destroy the world. So it's, so my God, to think that there are thousands, nuclear weapons did not reassure me very much, of course. So I think that there was a long period in which the question of a nuclear weapon was not so important, at least in the eyes of the public opinion. Do you think that in the 1990s or in the 21st century, people just spoke about nuclear weapon or nuclear disarmament or something like that? It was a question for politicians, diplomats, specialists, and so on. But people were more interested in climate change, for example. Than well, we know that somebody has nuclear weapons, but we don't think that they are going to make use of them. So there is North Korea, okay. That's a special problem, or there is Iran, or the terrorists, but yeah, and so it's but I think that from the political viewpoint, it was still important. So I don't think that some country would give up to their nuclear deterrent. I don't think that India would give up. I don't think that Pakistan would give up, and so on and so on, and North Korea not at all. So. What about the Zakaria question? Well, I agree. It was a missed opportunity, and I think that the relationship with Russia had to be. I think that they were more important than it was thought. Especially when Putin came to power. I am really impressed, really struck, by the attitude, of the media, of the public opinion in those weeks. Well, we discovered that Putin is a bad guy. My God, there was Chechnya in 2002, 2004. There was Georgia in 2008. There was Crimea in 2013. And now we discover in 2021 that Putin is a bad guy. What happened, is in power after 22 years, So we know him fairly well, Of course, are we going to go to war with Putin or to Russia? Or perhaps it's better to try to find out some compromise, some agreements, and so on. Of course, from a position of strength, not from a position of weakness. But of course, in my opinion, it would be important to start a long time ago. If I think about in the 1990s, but also in the 21st century, the beginning, there was an attitude by a lot of Russian, academic students, I met, with the Tempus Tacis project, this exchange of students, academics between Russia and Europe in the 1990s, and there was a very forthcoming attitude, They wanted to be regarded as a European. They wanted to be regarded as a part of Europe, It was an opportunity. And we forgot that, We accepted NATO enlargement. We accepted to deal with Putin when Putin was useful, in our opinion. War on terror. Okay, the Chechens are Islamic, so okay, they are killing them. No problem, you know. Georgia is very far. We don't care about Georgia, you know. And at the same time, it was useful because, you know, especially some countries such as Germany and Italy, we got oil and we got gas at cheap prices. So why not, you know? We forgot, well, Putin is a dictator. Well, that doesn't matter, you know, because Russia is stable. And if it's stable, he's going to give us gas and oil with no problem. And of course, at cheap prices. You know? So this is very short-sighted view, you know, just day by day. What lacked, in my opinion, was a sort of long-term perspective, you know, how to try to involve Russia in a stable European order, which does not mean that we must love, you know, Putin's democracy, you know. What about, you know, our relationship with other countries which are not democracies? We must not forget that most of the countries in the world are not democracies, you know, but we have a relationship with them, of course. Why not? Of course, our hope is that they can change and transform themselves into democracy. But, you know, till a few months ago, we had a good relationship with China, you know? And there was, you know, the famous, you know, Silk Belt, and the idea we have to develop stronger economic relationship with China. Because we knew that China is not a democracy. So that's, I think it's a sort of, in my opinion, what lacks in the European Union. But it's the problem of the European Union. Where's the power in the European Union? Is the Commission? Or is it, you know, the major member states, which means France and Germany, obviously. It's a problem. It's an open question, you know, and this is also a way to try to give an answer to your question. What about France? Well, it's amusing, you know. During the last few weeks, everybody began to speak. Well, we have to develop a European army. Oh my God, as an historian, I thought that it started in 1950, you know, so only 72 years ago, you know, only 70 years ago we started because, well, we must have a European army. And then Macron stated, okay, yeah, well, what's happening in Ukraine, it's important, and we have to strengthen the French army, not to create a European army. And they say, okay, in the context, perhaps France may play a leading role, you know, with other European states. That's a problem, you know. And of course, I don't like very much the French-German couple. I never liked it as an Italian, because obviously it means that Italy play a minor role, you know, so the French and the Germans, you know, so I don't like it. But in this period, I think that we need a French-German couple in order to develop a European position, position of the European Union. If the Germans and the French, they agree on a definite, strong position, I am convinced that most of the other member states will follow. So, and if they say, I think that I saw some change in the tones, you know, of the debate during the last few years. When Macron stated, okay, we must condemn Russia, we must help Ukraine, but at the same time, we must not forget that Russia is there. And we have to deal with that. Of course, we must not be French, you know. This is not the question. We must not love Putin, you know, but of course it's there. And of course, we must find some form of compromise, you know, some solution. First of all, my opinion, that's an opinion, you know. I am not an historian, I'm a citizen. My opinion, first of all, stop fighting, you know, and then we sit at the table and we try to find a solution, you know. That's my personal opinion. Nothing to do, you know, with the historian, nothing to do with my role as an historian. This is my opinion as a citizen. Stop.
Thank you so much.
Sono mai stato un pacifista. Questi giorni lo sono.
Thank you so much for being with us today. See you tomorrow morning with the next section with the Vice Rectors of International Relations of Italian University. Thank you to people from home. And I'll see you tomorrow. Thank you to the panelists as well. And it was very nice and interesting session. Thank you very much.
Thank you to you. Thank you for the time. Are very patient and we'll try to survive till now to 6:20. Okay. Thank you very much. Okay.